My brother looked straight at me in that glass-walled conference room and said almost casually, "She's too poor to matter here. Why invite me at all if I wasn't supposed to speak? Why did the CEO already have my file open before the meeting even started? And why did Ethan suddenly look nervous the second Richard Caldwell said my name? I had spent 3 nights building a financial report. No one asked for tracking transactions that didn't quite add up. I wasn't even on the executive team. I was just a contract analyst and his sister. But then Caldwell leaned forward, tapped the spreadsheet on the screen, and said, "Paisley, walk us through the discrepancy Ethan approved." In that moment, I realized this wasn't about being ignored anymore. It was about something he was trying to hide. If you're watching this from outside the US, tell me where you are and what time it is for you right now. I read every comment. And if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, you might want to stay for this. 3 days before that meeting, I was sitting at a narrow desk in a corner of the finance department that didn't even have my name on it. That was intentional. Officially, I was a contract financial analyst brought in to support reconciliation efforts. Unofficially, I was the quiet fix no one acknowledged. I didn't go to team lunches. I wasn't CC'd on executive threads. And nobody, not even the people who sat 10 feet away from me, knew I was Ethan Evans's sister. Ethan preferred it that way. Less confusion, he'd said the first week I started. What he meant was less association. Growing up, he had always been the one people pointed to. Straight A student, varsity captain, the son who made our last name sound like it meant something. When he got into a top business school, my mother Linda threw a party that filled our entire street. When I graduated with a finance degree 2 years later, we had dinner at home. No one ever said it out loud, but there was a quiet hierarchy in our family. Ethan at the top, always moving forward. Me. Steady, responsible, but never impressive enough to change the story, so when his company needed temporary help reviewing internal accounts before a major investor deal, I didn't hesitate. It was supposed to be a short contract, clean work, good reference. I told myself I didn't need anything more than that. The first week was exactly what I expected: routine reconciliation, vendor cross-checks flagging minor inconsistencies. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. Until the second week. It started with a number that didn't make sense. A mid-sized transfer just under the threshold that usually triggers automatic internal review. It was labeled as a consulting fee routed through a vendor I didn't recognize. That alone wasn't suspicious. Companies use outside consultants all the time. But when I ran the vendor ID, it didn't match any prior contracts. No history, no profile, no documentation attached. That was unusual. So I pulled the previous quarter's data. The same vendor name appeared again, and again, each time tied to a slightly different department, each time just under review thresholds, each time signed off at the same approval level. Ethan's level. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen longer than I meant to. There are patterns you learn to ignore in finance: rounding errors, timing differences, currency conversions. And then there are patterns that are too consistent to be accidents. This was the second kind. I told myself there was probably a simple explanation: a delayed vendor onboarding, a system glitch, something administrative. Still, I copied the entries into a separate worksheet, just to organize it, just to make it easier to review. By the time I finished, I had a list of transactions that stretched across 6 months. The amounts weren't massive individually, but together, it was enough to matter. Enough that someone should have noticed. Or maybe someone had. I checked the approval logs more carefully. Every one of those transactions had a digital signature attached. Verified, time-stamped, approved by Ethan Evans. I didn't jump to conclusions. That's the first rule you learn in this field: data before judgment. So I kept digging. I traced the payment routing paths looking for the final destination accounts. That's where things started to feel off. The accounts didn't belong to major consulting firms, or even mid-tier agencies. They led to a single entity, different branches, slightly varied names, but the same underlying registration number, a shell structure. I felt a slow, uncomfortable pressure build in my chest, because at that point it stopped being a question of accounting and started being a question of intent. I closed the file and rubbed my eyes, trying to think clearly. If this was legitimate, there would be documentation somewhere. Contracts, agreements, emails, something that explained why money was moving this way. So I searched internal correspondence tied to the vendor. Nothing. No onboarding threads. No negotiation emails. No performance reports. Just approvals. Clean. Quiet. Repeated. That's when I made a mistake. I printed a small portion of the data and walked to Ethan's office. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that if there was a misunderstanding, it would be resolved in 5 minutes. He didn't even look up when I knocked. "Make it quick," he said. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "I found something in the vendor payments," I said, keeping my voice steady. "There's a pattern I don't understand. I thought you'd want to review it before the report goes up." He took the paper from my hand without much interest. His eyes moved across the numbers once. Then again. Something in his expression shifted, but only for a second. Then it was gone. He set the paper down like it didn't matter. "You're overanalyzing," he said. "These are routine allocations. There's no documentation attached," I replied. "And the vendor, I said it's routine." His tone sharpened just enough to cut off the rest of my sentence. I hesitated, then tried again. "If it is, we should still have supporting files, especially with the investor review coming up." He leaned back in his chair and finally looked at me directly. And that was the moment everything changed. Not because he was angry, because he wasn't. He was calm. Too calm. "Paisley," he said quietly, "your job here is to organize data, not interpret it." The room felt smaller all of a sudden. "I'm not trying to interpret," I said. "I'm just flagging something that could become an issue later." He gave a short, almost amused breath. "Then let me make this simple for you." He tapped the paper once with his finger. "You're going to clean this up." I frowned. "What do you mean, remove the noise? Consolidate the entries, make it readable for the board? That changes the structure of the data. It improves it. It hides the pattern." That was when his expression hardened. For real this time. "You don't get to decide what matters," he said. "Not here." There it was again. That line. The same one he'd used in different ways our entire lives. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice level. If I adjust the report like that, it won't reflect the actual transactions. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Do you want to keep this contract?" The question landed heavier than anything else he'd said, because it wasn't really a question. It was a reminder of where I stood, of how easily I could be removed. I looked at the paper between us, then back at him. For a second, I almost said yes, almost agreed to fix it, smooth it over, keep things simple. That would have been easier, quieter, safer. Instead, I said nothing. And that silence stretched just long enough for something in his eyes to shift again, this time into something colder. "Adjust the report before it goes to the board," he said, already turning back to his screen. "I'll expect the updated version tonight." I left his office without arguing, but I didn't go back to my desk. I went straight to the stairwell where it was quiet enough to hear my own thoughts. Because for the first time since I started this contract, I wasn't thinking about reconciliation anymore. I was thinking about evidence and whether I was willing to be part of hiding it. When I got back to my desk, there was already a new email waiting. From Ethan. Subject line revised report. 2 sentences. Adjust the flagged entries before submission. Don't overcomplicate this. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then I opened the original file again. Not to edit it, to save a separate copy, with every log, every timestamp, every version history intact. Because if I was going to do this, I needed proof of what it looked like before anyone touched it. And as I scrolled through the approval records one more time, something else caught my attention, something I hadn't noticed before. A pattern in the digital signatures. Same authorization, same time window, different transactions. Processed in batches that didn't match normal business flow. I leaned closer to the screen, heart starting to beat just a little faster. Because this wasn't just irregular anymore. It was coordinated, and right at the center of it was Ethan's name. I didn't call Daniel right away. For a long time, I just sat there in my apartment, the glow of my laptop reflecting off the kitchen counter like it was the only light in the room. The city outside was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I kept replaying Ethan's voice in my head. You don't get to decide what matters. It wasn't new. That tone, that quiet certainty that he could define reality for everyone else. He'd been doing it since we were kids, rewriting stories, smoothing over consequences, turning mistakes into misunderstandings. But this wasn't a story. This was data, logged, time-stamped, verifiable. And if I was right, it wasn't just messy accounting, it was fraud. I finally picked up my phone and scrolled to Daniel Harper's name. We hadn't talked in months, but he was the one person I trusted to give me a straight answer without filtering it through family loyalty or office politics. He picked up on the second ring. Paisley. Everything okay? I almost said yes. Almost kept it simple. Instead, I said, I need to ask you something hypothetical. He let out a small breath. That usually means it's not hypothetical. I managed a tight smile he couldn't see. If someone works in finance and they notice a pattern of transactions that don't match supporting documentation, repeated transfers, same approval level routed through what looks like a shell vendor, what does that become? There was a pause on his end, not hesitation. Calculation. How solid is the data, he asked. Very. Emails. Logs. Originals. Yes. Another pause. Then more quietly, if what you're describing holds up, that's not a gray area, Paisley. That's potential financial misrepresentation. Depending on intent, it could rise to fraud. The word landed harder than I expected. I turned in my chair and stared at the wall. And if the person approving those transactions knew exactly what they were doing, then intent is easier to establish, Daniel said. Which makes it worse. I swallowed. And what about someone who's asked to adjust the report, not create the transactions, just present them differently, define differently, remove patterns, consolidate entries, make it look cleaner? There was no pause this time. That's participation, he said. Even if you didn't initiate it. The air in my apartment felt heavier. I pressed my palm against the edge of the desk, grounding myself. What if that person refuses? I asked. Then they're protecting themselves, Daniel replied. But they also need to be careful. If this goes further, documentation becomes everything. You keep copies of everything, originals, emails, version history. Don't rely on internal systems staying untouched. I glanced at my laptop screen where the duplicated files were already saved under a separate encrypted folder. "I've started that," I said. "Good." His voice softened slightly. "Paisley, who are we talking about?" I closed my eyes for a second. "My brother." Silence. Not the awkward kind. The kind that meant he understood the weight of what I'd just said. "Okay," he said finally, "then this isn't just legal. It's personal, which makes it harder to see clearly. I am seeing clearly. I said maybe a little too quickly. I'm sure you are. But you're also going to be pulled in 10 different directions. Family loyalty guilt. That's how these situations get complicated." I didn't respond right away, because he was right. Already I could hear my mother's voice in my head long before she actually said anything. "Family first. Don't make things worse. You don't understand the bigger picture." "I'm not trying to take him down," I said quietly. I don't want to be part of something that isn't right." "You don't have to decide everything tonight," Daniel said. "But you do need to decide one thing. Whether you're going to document the truth or help reshape it." I looked back at the screen, at the rows of numbers that now felt heavier than they should. "I'm documenting it," I said. "Then stick to that," he replied, "and be prepared for pushback." We hung up a few minutes later, but his words stayed with me. Documentation becomes everything. I went back to the file with a different mindset. Not just reviewing, building a record. I exported the transaction logs with full metadata timestamps, user IDs, approval chains. Then I pulled the version history of the report Ethan had asked me to adjust. Every edit was there, every change. Who made it? When? What was altered? I saved everything in multiple formats, backed it up externally, and emailed a time-stamped copy to a private account Daniel had suggested I use for safekeeping. It felt excessive. Until it didn't. Because the deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. These weren't random transactions. They were grouped. Approved within narrow time windows, usually late in the day just before system batch processing. Always below the threshold that triggered automatic flags. Always routed through variations of the same vendor structure. I opened one of the vendor profiles again. The name was slightly different this time. An extra word, a different suffix, but the registration number identical. I cross-referenced it with public business records. And that's when my chest tightened. The company wasn't completely invisible. It was registered. Just not in the way I expected. The listed address wasn't a corporate office. It was a residential property. I zoomed in on the listing, looked at the street name, the zip code. Something about it felt familiar. Too familiar. I clicked through the details again, slower this time. And then I saw it. The ownership structure. Layered like most shell entities. But buried in the filings, a managing member listed under a legal variation of a name I knew. I leaned back in my chair, heart beating faster now for a different reason. Because it wasn't just Ethan anymore. There was someone else connected to this, someone close enough to not need explanation. I reached for my phone without thinking, scrolled to my contacts, hovered over a name I hadn't called in weeks. My mother? Linda Evans. I didn't press call. Not yet. Instead, I went back to the approval logs. To confirm what I was starting to suspect. Because if I was wrong, I needed to know that before I said anything. But if I was right, this wasn't just about my brother hiding something, it was about my family being part of it. And as I zoomed in on the final transaction in the sequence, something else caught my attention. A digital signature. Not Ethan's this time. Different user ID, different authorization level, but tied to the same cluster of payments. I opened the user profile, read the name once, then again, and this time I didn't feel confused. I felt cold, because the account didn't just belong to someone connected to my family. It belonged to someone who had no reason to be anywhere near those approvals, which meant one thing: the system hadn't just been used, it had been shared or manipulated. And suddenly the question wasn't just what Ethan had done. It was how many people knew about it and how far it actually went. Fanbon, I didn't sleep that night. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't trust myself to wake up thinking the same way. By morning, I had already made a decision. If I waited, the data could change. If I hesitated, I could be pulled back into the version of the story Ethan wanted me to believe. And if I tried to handle this quietly inside the same structure that allowed it, I would lose control of it. So I opened my laptop, pulled up the report, and started writing an email. Not emotional, not accusatory, just precise. Subject line: discrepancies in vendor allocation data. I addressed it to Richard Caldwell, no one else. I attached 3 files. The first was a clean summary, clear, structured, easy to follow. It showed the repeated transactions, the vendor overlap, and the approval patterns in a way that didn't require a finance background to understand. The second was the full data set. Every entry, every timestamp untouched. The third was what mattered most. A comparison. Side by side, my original report and the version Ethan wanted submitted. Highlighted changes, removed entries, consolidated figures that erased the pattern completely. I didn't need to explain intent. The difference spoke for itself. I reread the email twice before sending it. No accusations, no conclusions, just one line at the end. I believe this requires independent review before being presented to the board. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a second. Then I clicked send. The message left my screen, and just like that, there was no taking it back. For a moment, everything felt still. Then the waiting started. I forced myself to stay focused, opened another file, checked another account, tried to move through the motions of a normal workday. But nothing about that day was normal. Every notification made my chest tighten. Every passing minute stretched longer than it should. An hour went by, then another. No response. I told myself that made sense. He was a CEO. He had a full schedule. My email wasn't the only thing on his desk. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already shifted. Around noon, I stepped out to get coffee, mostly just to breathe. When I came back, my inbox had one new message. From Richard Caldwell. No subject line, no greeting, just a single sentence. Received. Do not discuss this with anyone. That was it. No questions, no pushback, no request for clarification, just instructions. I read it twice, then a third time. The tone wasn't dismissive. It was controlled, deliberate. Like someone who already knew more than they were saying. A few seconds later, another notification appeared. This time not an email, a calendar invite, private meeting, tomorrow morning, before the board session, attendees, Richard Caldwell, Paisley Evans, no description. I leaned back in my chair, slowly letting the reality settle in. This was real now. Whatever I had sent it had landed exactly where it needed to, and it had been taken seriously, too seriously to ignore. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange, suspended quiet. No one approached me. No one asked questions, but I noticed things. Small changes, Conversations that stopped when I walked by. A manager who usually ignored me suddenly watching my screen for a second too long. A few files in the shared system that I had accessed earlier now locked, not deleted, just restricted, which told me something important. Someone had already started looking. Around 5, my phone buzzed. Ethan. I stared at his name on the screen for a second before answering. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice neutral. There was a pause on the other end. Not hesitation. Control. "Did you send something to Caldwell?" he asked. No greeting. No context. Straight to the point. I didn't answer immediately, and that silence was enough. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice tightening just slightly. "I submitted my report," I replied. "You went around me. I followed protocol." There was a short, humorless laugh. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't pretend this is about protocol." I stood up from my chair and walked toward the window, watching the traffic move below like it belonged to another world. "It is," I said. "We're presenting to the board. The data should be accurate." "The data is accurate," he snapped. "No," I said quietly. "The version you wanted isn't." That was the first time I pushed back directly, and it landed. I could hear it in the way he exhaled. Long, controlled, measured. "You don't understand the bigger picture," he said after a moment. "Then explain it to me." Another pause. But this one felt different. He wasn't choosing his words. He was choosing what not to say. "Just fix the report," he said finally. "Before tomorrow." "I'm not changing it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sharp. "You're making a mistake," he said. Maybe I replied. "But it's mine to make." There it was. A line I hadn't drawn before, and once it was there, I wasn't sure it could be erased. "You think Caldwell's going to back you?" Ethan said, his voice dropping lower now. "You think one email changes anything? I think the truth matters." He let out another short breath. "You always did," he said. "That's your problem." I didn't respond, because for the first time it didn't feel like a problem. It felt like clarity. "Be careful, Paisley," he added. "You're stepping into something you don't control." "I already am," I said. And then I ended the call. My hand stayed on the phone for a second longer than necessary. Not because I was unsure, because I knew what that conversation meant. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. It wasn't even just about evidence. It was about choosing sides, and I had just made that choice clear. I turned back to my desk and opened the files again. Not to change anything, just to look, to make sure everything I had seen was still there, still consistent, still real, because tomorrow morning I wouldn't be sitting quietly in the corner anymore. I would be in a room with people who expected answers, and across that table would be Ethan. But as I reviewed the data set one more time, something else caught my attention. A small detail I had overlooked before, not in the transactions, in the access logs. A login entry, late at night, from a device that wasn't registered to any employee. I frowned, scrolling further. The same device appeared again and again, always around the same time, always tied to the same cluster of approvals. I leaned closer, my pulse picking up, because that meant one thing. Someone wasn't just approving these transactions. They were accessing the system from outside the normal network, which shouldn't have been possible unless someone had given them a way in. The next time I saw Ethan wasn't at the office. It was at our mother's house. Linda had texted me earlier that afternoon, short, polite, almost careful in a way that didn't match her usual tone. "Dinner tonight?" You should come. She didn't ask. She never did. I almost ignored it. Part of me wanted to stay in my apartment, review my files one more time, keep everything contained in a space I could control, but I knew better. If I didn't go, they would come to me, and I wasn't ready for that. So I showed up at 7 exactly on time like I always had growing up. The house looked the same, neat, warm lighting, everything in its place, everything designed to feel stable, normal. Ethan's car was already in the driveway. Of course it was. I paused for a second before going inside, letting the quiet of the street settle around me. Then I opened the door. Paisley, my mother, called from the kitchen, her voice light, almost too light. You made it. I stepped in, setting my bag down by the door. Hi, Mom. Ethan was already at the table, leaning back in his chair like he owned the room. He didn't stand, didn't say hello, just watched me. That same controlled expression he'd had on the phone. I took the seat across from him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Linda came in with plates, placing them carefully in front of us like the arrangement mattered more than the tension sitting between us. We don't get together enough, she said, smiling as she sat down. I thought it would be nice. Nice. I almost said something, but I didn't. Because this wasn't about dinner, and we all knew it. Ethan was the first to drop the pretense. You went to Caldwell, he said, like he was commenting on the weather. Linda's smile didn't fade, but it tightened slightly at the edges. I kept my voice even. I submitted a report. You bypassed me. I reported what I found. That's not your role. It is if the data is wrong. The room went quiet again. Linda set her fork down carefully. Paisley? She said, her tone shifting, soft but firm. Your brother is under a lot of pressure right now. This deal he's working on, it's important. I'm aware, I said. Then you understand why timing matters, she continued. Why things need to be handled thoughtfully. Thoughtfully. That word sat wrong with me. Do you know what's in those reports? I asked her. Her eyes flicked to Ethan for a fraction of a second before coming back to me. That's not the point. It is the point. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his patience thinning. Don't do this, he said. Not here. Where then? I asked. Because you didn't want to talk about it at the office, because it's not a real issue. I held his gaze. It is. Linda let out a quiet breath like she was trying to reset the conversation. Paisley, listen to me, she said. Families don't turn on each other over misunderstandings. We handle things privately. We support each other. There it was. Not denial, not confusion. Positioning. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not exactly. Clarity. You knew, I said. It wasn't a question. Linda's expression didn't change, but the silence that followed answered it anyway. Ethan's jaw tightened. Careful, he said. No. I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. I think I'm finally being careful. Linda leaned forward now, her voice lowering. You're making this bigger than it is. I don't think I am. It's accounting structure, she said. Allocations, timing, things you don't fully understand yet. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. You're listed on the company, I said, quietly. That landed. I saw it in the way her shoulders stilled, in the way Ethan's eyes sharpened. Paisley, he started. I checked the registration, I continued. The vendor receiving those payments. It's tied to a company under your name. Linda's gaze held mine steady now. Deliberate. You went digging, she said. Yes. And you think that gives you the full picture? I think it gives me enough, Ethan pushed his chair back slightly, the sound cutting through the room. "This is exactly why I didn't want you involved," he said. "You see pieces and assume the worst. Then explain it," I said. He didn't. Instead, he shook his head like I was the one being unreasonable. "You're risking something you don't understand," he said. "That deal closes next week. Investors are watching everything. If this blows up now, it will blow up later." I cut in. "With more damage." Linda raised her hand slightly, trying to regain control. "Enough," she said. We both fell quiet. She looked at me. Really looked this time. Not as her daughter. As a problem. "You need to think about what you're doing," she said. "Not just for yourself. For all of us." I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't look away. "I am thinking about it." "Then think harder," she said. "Because once something like this leaves the room, you don't get to take it back." That was the closest she came to a warning. Or maybe it was a threat. I wasn't sure anymore. Ethan stood up, pacing once behind his chair before stopping. "If this deal goes through," he said, his voice quieter now, more controlled, "everything stabilizes. The company grows. We all benefit. Including you." He didn't have to say. "And if it doesn't?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, because there was only one answer. "It will," he said finally. Not confidence. Insistence. I sat there for a second looking at both of them, at the way they aligned without saying it directly, at the way the truth had already been decided in their minds, not by facts, but by what they needed to believe. And that was when I understood something I hadn't fully let myself accept before. This wasn't just Ethan making bad decisions. This was a system. One that protected itself. One that expected me to fall in line. Linda reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of mine. "Paisley," she said softly. "We're your family?" I looked at her hand, then back at her. "I know," I said, and for the first time it didn't feel like reassurance. It felt like a boundary I hadn't drawn yet. Ethan exhaled slowly like he was done negotiating. "When this closes," he said, echoing his words from earlier, "none of this will matter." He met my eyes, holding them. "Not even you." The words didn't hit like an insult. They hit like confirmation of exactly where I stood. I pushed my chair back and stood up. "I'm not changing the report," I said. No one tried to stop me. Not physically, but the silence I left behind felt heavier than anything they could have said. I picked up my bag, walked to the door, and paused for just a second before stepping out. The air outside felt colder than it had when I arrived. Cleaner, too. I walked to my car, my mind replaying every word, every look, every pause. Not questioning anymore. Not doubting. Just processing. Because whatever happened in that meeting tomorrow, I knew one thing for sure now. If I told the truth, I wouldn't just be exposing Ethan. I would be exposing all of them. And as I started the engine, my phone buzzed in my bag. A new notification. Not a message. A system alert. From the company network. I pulled it up, my pulse picking up again. Access log updated. I frowned, opening the details. The same unknown device from before. Logged in again. Just minutes ago. And this time it wasn't just viewing transaction records. It had accessed the report file I sent to Caldwell. By the time I walked into the building the next morning, I already knew I wasn't walking into a normal meeting. The lobby felt the same polished floors, quiet conversations, the low hum of elevators, but everything underneath it had shifted. At least for me. I kept replaying that alert from the night before. An unknown device, accessing the exact file I had sent to Caldwell. Not just viewing, opening, navigating, interacting. Someone had seen it. Someone who wasn't supposed to. I tightened my grip on my bag as I stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers climb one floor at a time. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked calm, collected. It didn't match how I felt. Because if that file had been accessed outside of Caldwell's control, then whatever I had uncovered wasn't contained anymore, and neither was the risk. The doors opened to the executive floor. Quiet. Too quiet. No assistants moving between offices, no early meetings spilling into the hallway, just a stillness that felt intentional, like the building itself was holding its breath. I walked toward the conference room, my heels echoing softly against the floor. Through the glass wall, I could already see them. Ethan at the head of the table. A few board members seated along the sides. Laptops open. Documents neatly arranged. Caldwell wasn't there yet. Ethan glanced up as I stepped inside, just for a second. Then he looked away like I didn't matter enough to hold his attention. The irony didn't escape me. I took a seat near the end of the table, the same place I'd been in the outline of this meeting from the beginning. Except this time, I wasn't there to observe. I placed my laptop in front of me but didn't open it right away. Instead, I let my eyes move across the room. Faces I recognized. Faces I didn't. People who would decide outcomes based on what they saw today. People who didn't know they were about to see something different than what they expected. Ethan cleared his throat, pulling the room's attention toward him. "Let's get started," he said, his voice steady, practiced. "I'll walk you through the financial overview ahead of the investor close." He stood moving toward the screen at the front of the room. Confident. Controlled. Like nothing had changed. The presentation loaded. Slide 1 overview numbers. Growth projections. Clean lines. Clean data. Too clean. I knew exactly what version he was using. Not mine. The adjusted one. The one where the pattern disappeared. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't interrupt. Not yet. Ethan moved through the first few slides smoothly, his voice even, his explanations clear. He had always been good at this, framing information, guiding perception, making complexity feel simple. That was part of the problem, because if you didn't know what to look for, you wouldn't question any of it. He reached the section where the vendor allocations should have raised questions. They didn't. Not in his version. He summarized them in 2 sentences and moved on. No breakdown, no detail, no pattern, just gone. I glanced around the table. No one reacted. No one pushed back. Why would they? There was nothing to react to. Ethan clicked to the next slide. And as you can see, he continued, all allocations are within expected ranges. No irregularities to report. That was the moment. The exact point where the truth split into 2 versions. The one he was presenting and the one I was sitting on. Before I could decide whether to speak, the door opened. Richard Caldwell walked in without rushing, but with a presence that shifted the room immediately. Conversation stopped. Eyes moved toward him. He took his seat at the center of the table, not saying anything right away. Just listening. Observing. Ethan didn't pause for long. He acknowledged him with a brief nod and continued. "As I was saying..." "Hold on." Caldwell's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room cleanly. Ethan stopped mid-sentence. A flicker of irritation crossed his face before it disappeared. "Yes," he said. Caldwell leaned back slightly, his gaze moving from the screen to me, then back to Ethan. I'd like to revisit the vendor allocations, he said. Ethan's posture tightened just a fraction. We've already covered that section, he replied. Briefly, there were no issues to highlight. Caldwell held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Then he said calmly, "Open the original file." The room went still. Ethan didn't move right away. "I'm using the finalized report," he said. "I'm aware," Caldwell replied. "Open the original." There was a beat of silence. Small, but heavy. I could feel the shift ripple through the room, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of tension that doesn't come from raised voices, but from control-changing hands. Ethan's jaw tightened. "That version wasn't prepared for presentation," he said. "It contains unverified open it." This time there was no room for interpretation, just instruction. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a second. Then he clicked. The screen flickered as the file changed. My file, the one I had sent, the one he had asked me to clean up. Rows of data appeared, detailed, unfiltered, uncomfortable. Caldwell turned slightly in his chair. "Paisley," he said. Every eye in the room moved toward me. I felt it, the weight of it, the expectation, the risk. But I also felt something else. Clarity. I opened my laptop, pulling up the same file. "Can you walk us through the discrepancy you flagged?" Caldwell asked. For a second, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. Ethan's voice in that meeting, too poor to matter. My mother's hand on the table, family first. Daniel's words, documentation becomes everything. Then I looked at the screen, at the numbers that didn't change depending on who was looking at them. And I started speaking. "These transactions," I said, keeping my voice steady, "are listed as consulting fees, but they follow a pattern that doesn't match standard vendor behavior." I moved the cursor, highlighting the first set. Each one falls just under internal review thresholds. Individually, they don't trigger alerts, but together they form a consistent structure. I clicked to the next section. Same vendor identifier, slightly varied names, no supporting documentation in the system. A murmur moved through the table. Quiet, but real. I continued. The approvals are also consistent. Same authorization level. Same time window, typically late in the day before batch processing. I paused just long enough for that to register, then added, all approved under the same account. I didn't need to say the name. Everyone could see it. Ethan shifted in his seat. "This is being taken out of context," he said. "These are standard allocations. They're not," I said before I could stop myself. The room went silent again. Not because I interrupted, because I didn't back down. I turned back to the screen. "There's also routing behavior that doesn't match standard vendor payments," I continued. "The funds are being directed to a set of linked entities." I opened the next file, the one that traced the structure. "These entities share a registration number, which indicates they're not independent vendors but part of a single network." Caldwell didn't interrupt, didn't guide. He just watched, letting the data speak and letting me finish. I zoomed in on the final section. "This network is registered under a company with direct ties to..." I stopped. Not because I didn't know what to say, because I knew exactly what would happen when I did. I could feel Ethan's attention on me now. Sharp, focused, warning. But it didn't matter anymore, because this wasn't about protecting him, or them, or anything they had built on top of this. It was about what was actually there, on record, in the system. I took a breath and said the name, Linda Evans. The name didn't echo, but it didn't need to. It landed. I saw it in the way the board members shifted slightly in their seats, in the way one of them leaned forward, squinting at the screen like he wanted to make sure he'd heard correctly. Ethan didn't move at first. Then he let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without any humor. "This is exactly what I was talking about," he said, turning toward the table instead of me. "Misinterpretation. She's connecting things that aren't actually related." No one responded. Not right away, because the name was still sitting there unchallenged. I didn't rush to defend it. I just clicked into the next layer of documentation. "The vendor entities are registered under different names," I said, keeping my voice even, "but they share a single parent structure. That structure lists Linda Evans as the managing member." I brought up the registration file. Clean. Public record. No speculation. Just data. One of the board members, an older man I didn't recognize, spoke first. "Is that a relative of yours?" he asked, glancing between me and Ethan. "My mother," I said. That shifted the room again. Not dramatically, but enough. Ethan leaned forward now, his tone tightening. "This is irrelevant," he said. "Ownership structures don't automatically imply wrongdoing. There are legitimate reasons to route." "Then explain the documentation gaps," Caldwell said quietly. Ethan paused. "Just for a second. Long enough for everyone to notice. There are internal records," he said. "They're just not reflected in this version." "Then why weren't they attached?" Caldwell asked. No answer. Ethan's jaw tightened. I kept going. Beyond the ownership, I said, pulling up the transaction logs again, there's also a pattern in how these payments are executed. I highlighted the timestamps. They're approved in clusters, same time window, same authorization level, often within minutes of each other. Another board member spoke up. "That could still be batching," she said. "End-of-day processing." "It could." I agreed. "If the access matched internal systems." I switched to the access logs. This is where it doesn't. The unfamiliar device ID appeared on the screen. Multiple approvals tied to these transactions originate from a device that isn't registered to any employee. That got a reaction. Not loud, but immediate. "What do you mean not registered?" someone asked. "Our system logs every authorized device," I said. "Company-issued laptops, secure terminals, remote access points. This ID doesn't match any of them." Ethan sat up straighter. "That doesn't mean it's unauthorized," he said. "It could be." "Then it should still be registered," I replied. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, because this wasn't opinion anymore. It was structure, process, verification. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed on the screen. "Show me the frequency," he said. I pulled up the filtered log. "The device appears consistently," I said. "Always during the same transaction windows. Always tied to the same vendor network." I paused, then added, "and always connected to the same approval chain." Silence settled over the room again, but this time it felt different. Heavier, more focused. Because the picture was starting to form. Not completely, but enough to raise questions that couldn't be ignored. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand over the back of his neck. "You're building a narrative out of fragments," he said. "You don't have context. You don't know how these accounts are structured behind the scenes." "Then clarify it," Caldwell said. Another pause. Ethan looked at him, then at me. For a moment I thought he might actually explain, offer something real, but instead he shifted. subtly, from defense to deflection. "This isn't the time for internal confusion," he said. "We have investors reviewing this data, introducing unverified claims into this room." "Unverified," the older board member cut in. "She's showing us your approvals." Ethan didn't respond immediately, because there was no clean way to argue that. So he tried something else. He turned back to me. "This is what happens when you give someone partial visibility," he said. "They don't understand the full scope, so they start connecting dots that shouldn't be connected." I met his gaze. "I understand the data," I said. "You understand a slice of it. Then show the rest." Another silence. Short, but final. Because that was the moment everyone realized something. If there was more context, Ethan wasn't offering it. Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Let's be clear," he said. "We have a set of transactions routed through a network of entities tied to a family member, approved under your authority, with missing documentation, and access logs that don't match internal controls." He let that sit for a second, then added, "That's not a fragment. That's a pattern." Ethan's hands tightened on the table. "This is being exaggerated," he said. "There are explanations for all of it." "Then provide them," Caldwell replied. Ethan didn't, not right away. Instead, he looked at me again, and this time there was something different in his expression. Not just frustration, not just anger. Something sharper, more personal. "You really think this ends well for you?" he said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the room anyway. I felt the weight of them, the implication behind them, family, reputation. Everything that had always been used to keep me in place. But something had already shifted, not in the room. In me. "This isn't about ending well," I said. "It's about being accurate." For a second, no one spoke. Then Caldwell turned slightly toward me. "Continue," he said. I nodded, pulling up the final section of my analysis. "There's one more layer," I said. "Something I haven't mentioned yet." Ethan's attention snapped back to the screen. Because he knew. Or at least he suspected. I clicked into the deeper access logs, the ones I had almost missed the night before. "These transactions don't just share approval patterns," I said. "They share system behavior that shouldn't be possible under normal security protocols." I zoomed in on the login sequence. Multiple approvals are being executed from outside the internal network. A ripple of tension moved through the room. "That would require authorized credentials," someone said. "Yes," I replied. "And if the device isn't registered, then the access isn't standard." I finished. I hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Because this was the point where the explanation stopped being technical and started becoming something else. Something that couldn't be easily explained away. I opened the final file. The one tied to that external access. And as the user profile loaded on the screen, I felt that same cold clarity from the night before settle in again. Because the account didn't just belong to someone connected to the company, it belonged to someone who should never have had that level of access. Which meant one thing. This wasn't just a financial issue anymore. It was a security breach. And as I looked at the name on the screen, I realized whoever had been approving those transactions from outside the system wasn't supposed to exist in that role at all. The name on the screen didn't belong to an executive. It didn't belong to finance. It didn't even belong to anyone who should have had access to internal approvals. "Tyler Evans," I said. The room didn't react the way it had when I said my mother's name. There was confusion this time. A few people glanced at each other, One of the board members frowned, clearly trying to place it. Ethan didn't look confused. He went completely still. That account, I continued, keeping my voice steady, has authorization credentials tied to transaction approvals within this dataset. Caldwell leaned forward slightly. Who is that? He asked. I didn't take my eyes off the screen. My younger cousin, I said. He's not an employee. That was when the tension in the room shifted again, sharper now, more focused. Not an employee, the older board member repeated. No, I said. No official role, no registered device. No reason to have access to internal financial approvals. Ethan finally moved. That's not accurate, he said quickly. He's done contract work. IT support. There's no record of that in the system, I replied. His jaw tightened. Because not everything is tracked the way you think it is. I clicked into the access log again, zooming in on the timestamps. This account isn't just logging in, I said. It's authorizing, approving, executing within restricted windows tied to these transactions. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of that to settle. Then added, from an unregistered device. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but I could see the shift in his focus, which means he said slowly, We're looking at unauthorized access to financial systems. Yes. Ethan shook his head, exhaling sharply. This is being framed in the worst possible way, he said. Tyler has helped with back-end work before. Temporary access isn't unusual. Temporary access is still logged, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt him aggressively. I just corrected him, and that made it harder to dismiss. Then the logs are incomplete, he said. They're not, I replied. Another board member leaned forward. Are you suggesting credentials were shared? She asked. I didn't answer immediately, because that question mattered. Not just legally, personally. I looked at the screen, at the login sequences, the approvals, the timing. Then I said carefully, I'm saying the access pattern doesn't match individual use, which was the most precise way to say it without making assumptions I couldn't prove. Caldwell nodded slightly like that was enough. Ethan didn't. You're turning operational shortcuts into violations, he said. This happens in fast-moving environments. People delegate. They rely on trusted individuals. Trusted individuals don't bypass security controls, the older board member said quietly. Ethan didn't respond, because he couldn't. Not without admitting something else. I scrolled back to the vendor structure. The financial pattern and the access pattern overlap, I said. Same timing, same accounts, same approval chain. I paused, then added, which means the irregularities aren't isolated. They were connected. That was the point. That was what made it impossible to ignore. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. His fingers steepled for a moment before he spoke. Let's step back, he said. We have 3 elements here. He held up one finger. Unusual financial routing through a vendor network tied to a family member. A second finger. Missing documentation supporting those transactions. A third. And system access that doesn't align with internal security protocols. He lowered his hand. That combination requires formal review. Ethan's voice came out tighter now. You're escalating this prematurely, he said. We haven't verified. We have enough to initiate, Caldwell said. Not loud, not aggressive. Final. The room absorbed that, and with it the direction of the conversation changed. This wasn't a discussion anymore. It was a process. Ethan pushed his chair back slightly, the movement controlled but sharper than before. This is going to impact the deal, he said. Investors won't wait for internal audits. They won't wait for undisclosed risk either. Caldwell replied. That landed, because it wasn't about blame, it was about exposure. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. For a moment, he looked less like the person who had dismissed me at the start of this meeting and more like someone trying to regain control of something that had already shifted. This can be resolved internally, he said. There's no need to involve external review. Caldwell didn't respond right away. He looked at me instead. Not for permission, for confirmation. Paisley, he said, based on what you've seen, do you believe this is contained? It was a simple question, but it carried weight, because it wasn't just about data anymore. It was about scope. I thought about the vendor network, the repeated transactions, the external access, the shared credentials, and the fact that I had only been looking at one slice of the system. No, I said. The word came out steady. Clear. I don't think it's contained. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncertain this time. It was decisive. Caldwell nodded once. Then we proceed accordingly. Ethan looked at him, something like disbelief flashing across his face. You're going to move forward based on this, he asked. Based on the pattern Caldwell said, and the risk it represents. Ethan's gaze shifted to me again, and this time there was no attempt to hide what he was feeling. Not frustration, not irritation, something deeper. Betrayal. You didn't have to do this, he said quietly. I held his gaze. Yes, I did. He looked away first, just for a second, but it was enough, because for the first time in that room, he didn't control how the story was being told. Caldwell stood signaling the end of the discussion. We'll pause here, he said. Further steps will be communicated directly. Chairs moved. Laptops closed. The room began to break apart, but the tension didn't leave with it. It stayed, lingering in the space between what had been revealed and what was about to follow. I closed my laptop slowly, my hands steady even if everything else inside me wasn't. This wasn't over. Not even close, because uncovering the pattern was one thing. Proving it fully and dealing with what came after was something else entirely. And as I stood to leave, my phone buzzed again in my bag. Another notification. Another system alert. I pulled it up my breath, catching just slightly. User access modified. I frowned, opening the details. The account tied to Tyler Evans had just been deactivated. But not by IT. By an internal admin override, and the authorization attached to that change wasn't Ethan's. The notification stayed on my screen longer than it should have. User access modified. Tyler's account gone. Not suspended through standard IT protocol. Not flagged through a security escalation. Just removed. Cleanly. Quietly. I stood there in the hallway outside the conference room, watching employees pass by like nothing had changed, even though everything had. Because someone inside the system had just acted, and it wasn't Ethan. I looked closer at the authorization line. Admin override. High-level credentials. Not CFO. Not standard IT, which meant only a handful of people could have done it. I didn't have to guess. Come with me, Caldwell's voice said from behind me. I turned. He was already walking toward his office, not waiting to see if I'd follow. I did. The door closed softly behind us, shutting out the hallway noise. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He walked to his desk, picked up a folder, and set it down in front of me. Sit, he said. I did my pulse steady, but my mind moving fast. He didn't waste time. I deactivated the account he said, so that answered that. Why now, I asked. Because leaving it active would compromise the integrity of the review, he replied, and because I wanted to see who would react to it. I frowned slightly. React how? He studied me for a second like he was deciding how much to say. People who rely on access patterns tend to notice when those patterns break, he said, sometimes faster than they should. I understood what he meant. You remove a door and the people who were using it show themselves. Have they? I asked. Not yet, he said, but they will. He opened the folder. Inside were documents I hadn't seen before. Audit summaries, internal flags, notes. This didn't start with you, he said. I felt that before he even finished the sentence. But you're the first one to connect it clearly, he added. I leaned forward slightly, scanning the pages. There were prior inconsistencies, smaller ones, isolated, written off as timing issues, reconciliation delays, minor reporting gaps. Nothing big enough to escalate. Until now. You suspected, I said. I observed he corrected. Suspicion requires intent. Observation requires patterns. That sounded like him. Measured. Controlled. And now I asked. Now we verify. He tapped one of the documents. Independent audit. External if necessary. Full review of vendor structures, approval chains, and access control. I nodded slowly. This was bigger than I had thought. Not just a few transactions. A system. A pattern that had been building long before I noticed it. What happens to Ethan? I asked. Caldwell didn't answer immediately. Process comes first, he said. Findings determine outcomes. It wasn't a comforting answer, but it was a real one. And my mother, I added quieter. He met my gaze. If she's connected through ownership, that will be examined as well. There was no softness in that, no hesitation, just fact. I sat back, letting that settle, because for all the clarity I had felt in that meeting, this part still hurt. Not because I doubted what I had found, but because of what it meant. Caldwell closed the folder. There's something else, he said. I looked up. You're not a contract analyst anymore. I blinked. What I'm formalizing your role, he continued. You'll be working directly with the internal review team. Effective immediately. That wasn't what I expected. Not here. Not now. I didn't do this for a position, I said. I know, he replied. That's why you're being offered one. I didn't answer right away, because part of me still felt like I was standing in that conference room being told I didn't matter. And now I did. Not because of him, because of what I had done. I'll consider it, I said finally. That's fair, he replied. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, You should be aware Ethan won't be part of this process. I felt my chest tighten slightly. Meaning he's been placed on administrative leave, Caldwell said, pending review. That was fast. Faster than I expected. He didn't seem like he was expecting that, I said. He wasn't, Caldwell replied. I nodded slowly, because that meant something important. Whatever control Ethan thought he had, it was already slipping. I stood gathering my things. Thank you, I said. Not for the position, for the clarity. He gave a small nod. Be careful, he said. This doesn't end cleanly for everyone. I almost smiled. I'm starting to understand that. I left his office and stepped back into the hallway. The building felt different now. Not quieter, sharper, like everything was being watched more closely. Or maybe I was just seeing it differently. My phone buzzed again. This time, not a system alert. A message. From Ethan. I stared at his name for a second before opening it. You went further than I thought you would. No greeting, no context. Just that. I typed a response, then deleted it. Typed again. Deleted again. Finally, I sent one line. I told the truth. The reply came faster than I expected. That's not the whole truth. I stared at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then I stopped. Because something about that message didn't feel like deflection. It felt deliberate. Like he was pointing at something I hadn't seen yet. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop again, right there in the hallway, pulling up the files. The transactions, the logs, the access records, everything I had already reviewed, everything I thought I understood. I went through it again, slower this time, not looking for confirmation, looking for gaps. Because if Ethan was right about one thing, it was that I had been focused on a pattern, and patterns can hide things just as easily as they reveal them. I traced one of the earlier transactions, then another, then a third, not in order this time, out of sequence, looking for something that didn't fit. And that's when I saw it. A single entry, small, buried, different from the others. It didn't follow the same routing path, didn't use the same vendor structure, didn't even fall within the same time window. I zoomed in, checked the approval, checked the access log. My pulse picked up, because this one had been authorized internally, from a registered device, with full credentials, no anomalies, no flags, clean. And the name attached to that approval wasn't Ethan, wasn't my mother, wasn't Tyler. It was someone else, someone who had been sitting in that room, watching me present, saying nothing. Fan Mui. I stared at the name longer than I should have, not because I didn't recognize it, but because I did. It was Melissa Grant, Senior Vice President of Operations. She had been sitting 3 seats to the left of Caldwell that morning, quiet, attentive, taking notes, asking nothing. I replayed the meeting in my head, every reaction, every pause. She hadn't defended Ethan. She hadn't challenged me either. She had just observed. And now her name was sitting inside a transaction that didn't fit the pattern. Clean approval, no missing logs, no external access, no shell routing. Which meant one thing. If Ethan's side of the system was structured to hide something, this wasn't part of it. This was something else. I pulled the transaction details closer, scanning every field. The amount was smaller than the others, insignificant compared to the total flow I had been tracking, but the destination account was different. Not part of the vendor network tied to my mother, a separate entity. I opened the account profile, then the registration, then the linked documentation, and that was when the final piece fell into place. Not all the money had been moving in the same direction. Some of it had been siphoned off before it ever reached the shell structure. Quietly, cleanly, without breaking any rules on the surface, which meant Melissa hadn't been outside the system. She had been inside it, using it properly, just for something it wasn't meant for. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the realization settle. Ethan wasn't the only one manipulating the system. He had built one pattern. She had built another. And neither of them knew about the other. That was why it hadn't surfaced earlier. That was why the audit flags had stayed small. They weren't overlapping enough to trigger anything obvious. Until now. Until everything had been pulled into the same light. I exhaled slowly and gathered my things. Because there was no point holding on to this. Not anymore. If I had learned anything through all of this, it was that partial truth wasn't safer. It was just delayed damage. I walked back to Caldwell's office and knocked once. "Come in." He looked up as I stepped inside, his expression sharpening slightly when he saw my face. "There's more," I said. He didn't ask what. He just gestured for me to continue. I placed my laptop on his desk and pulled up the transaction. "This one doesn't match the pattern," I said. "Different routing, different structure. Fully compliant on the surface." He leaned in, scanning the details. "Why flag it?" he asked. "Because it sits next to the others," I replied. "Same time frame, same approval cycle. But it diverts funds before they reach the network I traced." He didn't interrupt, didn't rush. He followed the logic, step by step. Then his gaze shifted to the approval line and stopped. "Melissa Grant," he said. "Yes." A long pause followed. "Not uncertainty. Calculation." "Are you suggesting coordination?" he asked. "No," I said. "I think it's the opposite." He looked back at me. "They're not working together," I continued. "They're operating in parallel. Different methods, same environment." He leaned back slowly. "That's worse." It was, because it meant the system hadn't just been exploited. It had been understood by more than one person. "Do you have more than one instance?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. "But this one is clean enough that it wouldn't trigger flags unless you were looking for it." He nodded once. That was enough. "Then we expand the scope," he said. "No hesitation, no second guessing, just a decision." I closed my laptop. For the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me again. Not tension, not fear. Relief. Because this wasn't mine to carry alone anymore. The system would be examined. Fully. Completely. Not just the parts that were easy to isolate. I stood to leave, but Caldwell spoke again. "You understand what this means," he said. I turned slightly. "It means this isn't just about your family anymore." "I know," I said. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Good." I left his office without saying anything else. The hallway felt quieter now, not because people had disappeared, because I had stopped looking at them the same way. I walked out of the building and into the afternoon light, letting the air hit my face. For a long time, I just stood there, breathing, not rushing to the next step, not trying to control the outcome. Because for once, I didn't need to. Weeks later, the results came in. Ethan's approval suspended, investigated, formally tied to undisclosed financial routing through entities connected to my mother. Linda, named in the ownership structure, pulled into the legal review. Tyler, his access, traced his involvement, documented. And Melissa, her transactions, uncovered a separate misuse of internal authorization, smaller in scale, but intentional, careful, hidden in plain sight. None of it collapsed overnight. There were processes, reviews, legal steps that took time. But the direction was clear, and for the first time, none of it depended on me proving anything. The truth had its own structure now, one that didn't bend for family or reputation or convenience. My phone rang a few times during those weeks. Ethan once. My mother twice. I didn't answer. Not out of anger, out of clarity, because there was nothing left to explain and nothing left to negotiate. When Caldwell's offer came through formally, I accepted it. Not as a reward, as a responsibility. Something built on what I had done, not what I had endured. I moved to a new office. Same building, different floor, different view. And on my first day there, I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and looked at a clean screen. No hidden patterns, no unresolved logs, just work. Real work. The kind that didn't require me to question whether I was being asked to ignore something. For the first time in a long time, I felt steady. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had stopped trying to be part of something that wasn't right. And as I closed my laptop that evening, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Walking away from people who misuse you isn't failure. It's alignment. I used to think that loyalty meant staying no matter what, no matter how uncomfortable things became. That if you just held on long enough, people would eventually see you clearly treat you fairly, value you the way you deserved. But that's not how it works. Sometimes the people closest to you benefit from you staying small, from you not asking questions, from you not noticing patterns that don't make sense. And when you finally do, when you speak, when you document, when you refuse to reshape the truth to protect them, it doesn't feel like strength at first. It feels like loss. Because you're not just exposing a problem. You're letting go of a version of family you hoped was real. What I learned is that boundaries aren't punishment. They're protection. And forgiveness, if it ever comes, doesn't mean giving someone access to you again. It doesn't mean stepping back into the same dynamic that required you to shrink in the first place. You can understand someone's choices without accepting them. You can care about people and still choose distance. If you've ever been in a position where telling the truth cost you a relationship, I see you. It's not easy, but it matters. And if you're listening to this from somewhere in the world, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is for you right now. Stories like this remind us we're not alone, even when it feels like we are. If this resonated with you, you can stay connected by subscribing. There are more stories here not about perfect endings, but about real ones. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.